Hello, everybody. Welcome back to day number 4 of week 2 of our journey through the Bible. And we're about halfway through the book of Genesis. Today we're reading Genesis 24 and 25, also hitting Psalms 4 and Mark chapter 9. So if you need to pause here, go back and read those, and then come back and catch up with us then. We're starting to get into more of the relationship and the family in Genesis. The family, Abraham's family, of course. We've seen Abraham and Sarah and all of the issues and kind of the humanity. It's one of the things that I think we tend to forget about with a lot of these patriarchs and matriarchs of our faith is the humanity that they dealt with. And we're starting to see that Sarah, of course, has passed away, and it's time for Isaac to find a wife. When the story of Isaac and Rebekah in chapter 24, Isaac is about 40 years old when this is taking place, and so it's time for him to find a wife and to continue this line. And so Abraham sends off his his right hand man, his number one servant guy that's been with him the longest. He's not named. And sends him off to Abraham's homeland to find a wife for Isaac. He doesn't want Isaac to get in line and marry any of the Canaanites and these people that, of course, that we see. The farther we get into, especially into Joshua, where we see the fighting with the Canaanites, he doesn't want his son intermarrying with these quote unquote outside people, and so. So he sends his number one guy off to his homeland, to Abraham's homeland, which is kind of northeast of what we traditionally think of Israel, kind of in in Turkey and Iraq area. So the servant goes, and the servant is a follower of God as well, and he says this wonderful prayer, asking for a sign and saying, Lord, let the woman that is to marry Isaac, let her come and say these things to me when I ask her for water. And of course, Rebecca comes and she answers this prayer. And it's just another great example of petitioning God, and you're allowed to ask God for am I doing this? Is this the right path, right? And so Rebecca, of course, agrees to marry Isaac with sight unseen, and then we see it towards the end. The servant brings Rebecca back to where Isaac and Abraham are living, and Isaac, and we see this throughout the majority of the Bible. Isaac, he goes off and he's off by himself, and he's kind of praying, and he's off by himself, having quiet time with the Lord, and he sees the caravan coming towards him. He sees his soon-to-be wife, and Rebecca sees him, and I really enjoyed that verse 67 of chapter 24, excuse me, holy cow, where it says, then Isaac brought her into the tent of Sarah his mother and took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her. We tend to think, at least I know I do, when we read these ancient stories, we think more of marriage as being an arranged thing, and this was absolutely an arranged marriage, and they hadn't met before, and but we think of more of a functionality. Husbands and wives were more helpers, and they're co-workers in a way, rather than love. And I think this is a good reminder that Isaac loved Rebekah, and this kind of one of the first great marriage of the Abrahamic line is based on love, and it's something to kind of remember as we go forward. And then, of course, we get into chapter 25, and we get the Abraham's death, and it kind of goes through the descendants. We do see that Ishmael and Isaac bury their father, and so they're at the very least they have open communication between the two sons, which of course is a great sign. Anybody that's been in a family, it's better that the boys, the sons get along, right? Even though they were completely separated, and Isaac was the main birthright heir to Abraham. Then we see Isaac and Rebekah again Rebekah is having issues with having children, and she's barren, and it kind of reminds very much of Sarah. And Isaac prays to the Lord on behalf of his wife, and the Lord answers the prayer, and she's pregnant with these two rambunctious boys, twin boys. And I really like this, what the Lord responded to Rebekah and says, "The two nations are in your womb, and two peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other. The older shall serve the younger." Now, of course, as in a lot of societies, the ancient Hebrew society was very much in a birthright, and we see this as we get into this. Very much in the birthright error. So the oldest son, he gets top billing, and then it kind of goes down from there. And of course, women, and we're going to get into women in the ancient Hebrew culture. They are kind of forgotten all the way around anyway. But God says that the younger is the older is gonna serve the younger, and we see this right away as they're older, as the boys had gotten older. Of course, Genesis isn't going to follow a day. It's not a day-by-day journal. We bounce quickly to the boys being as adults, and of course, Esau is more of the outside guy. He's out. He's the hunter. He's the farmer. He's doing all these things. Where Jacob is the kind of the homebody, and he's favored by his mother Rebekah, where Esau is favored by his father Isaac. And so Esau is out, and he comes back in, and he's hungry, and he wants some food, and Jacob serves him up some stew, but offers it to buy Esau's birthright. And my notes in this, Esau, this is very much a sin, because God put him first, right? And so Esau just basically just doesn't appreciate his birthright, and we see this later on with the for more infighting between Jacob and Esau. This is just kind of the beginning of this, and Esau goes off and has to do his own thing, and my translation says at the end of chapter 25, thus Esau despised his birthright, that he just didn't care, and that obviously comes back to bite him later on. So flip over to Psalm 4, a short one today, and it's kind of a psalm on prayer. Is the way that I am trusting in God, and I really like the verse 3 of chapter 4 of Psalm 4. But know that the Lord has set apart the godly for Himself. The Lord hears when I call to Him. The Lord hears, and we see this in a couple different times in the Genesis stories, where the master had prayed to God, and God heard his story. And then later, Isaac prays to God about Rebekah being barren, and God hears his prayer. So, we go through these tough times, but remember that God has set you apart, and He's going to hear you when you call out to Him. So we flip back over to Mark. We're in Mark chapter 9, and a lot in Mark chapter 9, we start with the Transfiguration. And of course, the Transfiguration is a tough one, because it doesn't make any sense that Elijah and Moses are there. But we have to remember we're trying to put God. That's putting God into a box, and we can't put God into a box. If God wants to bring Elijah and Moses from thousands of years ago and put them on the mountain with Jesus, He can absolutely do that, where He's not confined by the structures of humanity and things like that. And so, but the bigger story for me here is, Jesus brings Peter, James, and John, kind of his core, the core guys, the core disciples, brings them with Him up to witness this event. And we see that God comes down on the cloud, and He says, "This is my beloved Son, listen to Him." And this is more speaking to the three, James, John, and Peter, that they need to pay attention to what Jesus is doing, and they're still not fully getting it. They aren't understanding. We see when Peter, wants to set up the tents for the three, and that's not the point. They're not dwelling in this, and all these things that like Peter's wanting, and we see, and of course this gets repeated in Luke, and we're going to get into the differences of Luke's version to Mark's version, but the men are arguing about the death and the resurrection. They don't understand that the Son of Man has to die. They're not getting this, and they're still, and you can almost kind of feel the frustration of Jesus. And he's like, "Man, you guys just aren't getting this." Uh, uh, and so they get this figured out, and then of course they go down and they're dealing with this unclean spirit, and the disciples had tried to save this boy, to cast out the demons. And a great line, and I've underlined this in my Bible, and it says, "This kind cannot be driven out by anything other than prayer." And deep and effectual prayer. And and as somebody that has dealt with addiction, I wrote my addiction in notes in my Bible. This was not something that I could have done just by myself, right? This was not a demon that I could beat just myself. I had to go to prayer to beat this. And so there's it's one of those things that we just need to pray continually and pray earnestly and pray with our hearts. And that's kind of the point. Again, the great line there that when who's the greatest among these, and Jesus grabs the little kid. And remember, in this culture, children were very much seen but not heard, and they were very much forgotten individuals. Children had no rights. They did as they were told. And so Jesus taking this child into his arms would have been a very major turning point in that culture. This is something that the disciples would not have said, or would not have considered even. In verse 37 it says, "Whoever receives one such child in my name receives me, and whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me." And this is another way of Jesus saying that I am sent by God, right? And again, they're just not getting it. We see the temptations to sin there at the end of verses 42 through 50, the end of Mark chapter 9. And of course, a lot of these are kind of following in line with the Sermon on the Mount that we see more diligently written about in Matthew. And Jesus kind of goes through, and the famous, if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. If your eye causes you to sin, cut it out. And God is obviously using hyperbole here to prove the point. Obviously, we're not. If every one of us that sinned with our eyes cut our eyeballs out, there wouldn't be a single person with an eye left. So it's not not necessarily to be taken literally there, that we need to cut our hands off or cut our eyeballs out or cut our feet off. It's just kind of proving the point of how serious sin is. And this, of course, leads into the greater discussion on sin, which we will get into at various different times throughout the New Testament. Sin is definitely something that we deal with on a daily basis. Every single one of us, has our issues, and it really just comes down to the heart, and we need to change our heart, against sin, rather than necessarily the physical cutting out of our eyes or anything like that. So a lot of great stuff. Hope you guys are enjoying the series. I know I am. Week 2 concludes tomorrow, where we read Genesis 26 and 27 and Mark chapter 10. So we'll look forward to seeing you back then tomorrow.